Something is happening right now that most people don't fully grasp. Not in science fiction, not in some distant theoretical future. Right now, in the coastal marshes of South Texas, under the blistering Gulf sun, a machine is being assembled that could redefine what it means to be human. A machine so large it blocks out the horizon. A machine that breathes liquid methane and oxygen, shakes the ground for miles, and is being built, not for one mission, but for thousands. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. Welcome, sit down, make yourself comfortable, pour that tea. Because what you're about to hear is either the most inspiring story of our generation or the most dangerous gamble in the history of civilization. Perhaps both. SpaceX has publicly declared its intention to land humans on Mars. That much you probably know. But the real story, the one happening in the shadows of FAA filings and obscure engineering memos, goes much deeper. There are timelines being discussed behind closed doors that make even optimistic observers nervous. There are technical decisions being made today that will determine whether those first astronauts live or die. And there are questions that nobody in the mainstream conversation seems willing to ask out loud. Let's ask them. The machine at the edge of the world. Drive south along the Texas coast, past Brownsville, past the last gas station, past the last hint of civilization, and you'll find it. Starbase, Boca Chica. What was once a sleepy beach town with a population of a few dozen has been transformed into the most ambitious private aerospace complex ever constructed. Starbase isn't just a launch facility, it's a cathedral, a monument to a single man's obsession with making humanity multi-planetary. Walk through its gates and you'll see towering assembly bays where stainless steel cylinders are stacked like silver skyscrapers. You'll hear the shriek of hydraulic systems and the low rumble of cryogenic fuel flowing through pipes as wide as subway tunnels. You'll smell the sharp bite of liquid oxygen in the salt air. This is where Starship is being born. But what exactly is Starship? The name sounds almost mythological, and in some ways, the reality matches the myth. Starship is a two-stage, fully reusable launch system. And those 5 words, strung together, represent something genuinely revolutionary. No rocket in history has ever been both fully reusable and this large. At roughly 123 meters tall and counting, it is the tallest rocket ever flown. It is taller than the Saturn V that sent men to the moon. It generates more thrust at liftoff than any rocket in human history. The first stage, the Super Heavy booster, is studded with 33 Raptor engines, each burning methane and liquid oxygen in a methalox combustion cycle specifically chosen because methane can potentially be manufactured on Mars from atmospheric CO2 and subsurface water ice. This wasn't an accident. Every major design decision in Starship traces back to Mars. The second stage, the Starship spacecraft itself, sits on top. A gleaming bullet-shaped vessel designed to carry up to 100 passengers, or 100 plus tons of cargo, to orbit and beyond. It uses 6 more Raptor engines, 3 sea-level variants for atmospheric flight, 3 vacuum-optimized engines for the void of space. Its belly is covered in hexagonal ceramic heat shield tiles, over 18,000 of them, each one individually fitted, each one a potential single point of failure, if even one is lost during re-entry. The early years of Starship testing were, to put it gently, explosive. SN8, SN9, SN10, SN11. Prototype after prototype either exploded on the pad, flipped end over end during descent, or detonated in spectacular fireballs on landing. Critics called it reckless, wasteful, dangerous. SpaceX called it rapid iterative development and kept building. The philosophy is almost Darwinian. Build fast, break things, learn from the wreckage. Each destroyed prototype carried sensors that transmitted data until the moment of destruction. Each fireball taught the engineers something that no simulation could. The turning point came in 2024 and accelerated dramatically through 2025. Integrated flight test after integrated flight test pushed the envelope further. The system began catching its own booster mid-air using the Mechazilla tower's mechanical arms, a feat so audacious that aerospace veterans compared it to catching a falling skyscraper with a pair of chopsticks. And it worked, repeatedly. Then came Flight 10 on August 26, 2025. The date will be remembered. Both stages performed flawlessly. Super Heavy descended through a sunset sky and settled gently into the Gulf of Mexico. Starship survived re-entry, surviving temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Celsius, and splashed down controlled in the Pacific. For the first time in history, a rocket the size of a skyscraper had flown to space, and both pieces came home intact. Flight 11 followed on October 13, 2025, confirming it wasn't a fluke. The crunch wrap thermal protection configuration, an upgraded tile geometry and edge sealing system, proved robust. Engineers dissected the data with the obsessive intensity of surgeons reviewing their own surgery. The thermal margins were better than predicted. The control authority during hypersonic re-entry was precise. The system was maturing, but here is where the story gets darker. Here is where the applause should quiet and the questions should begin. Version 3. The machine that might go to Mars. Starship. Version 3 is not just an upgrade. It is the threshold. The first flight of V3 is planned for spring 2026. March, if the FAA cooperates, if the weather holds, if the dozens of subsystems perform as modeled. At 124.4 meters, it stands fractionally taller than its predecessor, but the numbers that matter are internal. The Raptor 3 engines powering V3 represent a generational leap. Raptor 1 was already the highest pressure rocket engine ever flown. Raptor 2 pushed further. Raptor 3 has been redesigned from the combustion chamber outward, eliminating external plumbing by routing propellant lines internally through the engine wall itself. The result is a cleaner, lighter, more reliable engine with higher thrust and dramatically simplified assembly. Each engine can now be installed or replaced in under an hour. This matters enormously for the turnaround times SpaceX needs to make its vision economically viable. V3 is projected to deliver over 100 tons to low Earth orbit in fully reusable mode. For reference, the Saturn V could deliver 130 tons to LEO, but was entirely expendable. NASA's Space Launch System, which costs over $2 billion per launch, delivers about 95 tons. SpaceX intends to eventually build Starship for roughly $5 to $10 million per vehicle and reuse it dozens of times. The economics, if they work, are transformative. But notice the phrase, if they work. Starship Phi 3 will need to not just fly. It will need to demonstrate on-orbit refueling, the critical technology that makes Mars missions possible. Without refueling in space, a Starship leaving Earth's orbit simply cannot carry enough propellant to break into Mars orbit, descend through the Martian atmosphere, land, and then produce enough fuel on the surface for a return journey. The math doesn't close. Physics is merciless. The on-orbit refueling demonstration planned for 2026 to 2027 involves launching one Starship as a propellant depot, allowing it to loiter in orbit while a second Starship rendezvous and transfers liquid methane and liquid oxygen through couplings that must work in microgravity. Where fluids behave in deeply unintuitive ways, forming floating spheres rather than settling in tanks, requiring special transfer mechanisms, ullage pressurization, and precise thermal management to prevent boil-off. This has never been done at this scale before, ever, in the entire history of spaceflight. NASA attempted cryogenic propellant transfer experiments in low Earth orbit and found the challenges formidable. Propellant boil-off in space is real. liquid oxygen and methane gradually warm and vaporize unless actively cooled, and active cooling in a spacecraft adds mass, complexity, and failure modes. SpaceX has designed systems to address this, but until those systems are tested in the actual thermal and microgravity environment of deep space orbital operations, uncertainty remains. There's a whisper in certain aerospace circles, a question nobody at SpaceX's press events ever seems to ask directly. What if the on-orbit refueling doesn't work reliably enough to be scheduled and launched on the tight windows that Mars missions require? Every 26 months, the orbital geometry aligns. Miss the window, and you wait more than 2 years. And on a mission to Mars, waiting 2 years means your crew either has to wait on the surface or come home early with the mission incomplete. The 2026 window. 5 ships into the void. The plan for the 2026 Mars launch window is audacious, even by SpaceX standards. 5 uncrewed Starship 5, 3 vehicles, launched in quick succession during the narrow transfer orbit window that opens in the late fall of 2026, each carrying a mix of cargo, scientific instruments, ISRU, in situ resource utilization, equipment, construction materials, and systems designed to test critical technologies on the Martian surface. The journey itself takes approximately 7 to 9 months, depending on the precise trajectory chosen. During that time, each Starship will be completely autonomous. No crew to react to emergencies, no human hand to flip a switch if something goes wrong. The vehicles will communicate with Earth, but with a signal travel time of up to 24 minutes each way, Mission Control's ability to intervene in real time is essentially zero. They will watch. They will analyze telemetry. They cannot help. Entry, descent, and landing on Mars is terrifyingly difficult. Mars has an atmosphere, but only barely. At roughly 0.6% of Earth's atmospheric pressure, it's thick enough to cause significant aerodynamic heating on entry, requiring thermal protection, but far too thin to provide meaningful deceleration through drag alone. You need heat shields and retro-propulsion engines firing against your direction of travel at the same moment you're screaming through superheated plasma at hypersonic speeds. The EDL sequence, entry, descent, and landing, for a vehicle the size of Starship on Mars, has never been attempted. NASA's Mars Science Laboratory, which carried Curiosity, weighed about 1 ton at landing and required the legendary Sky Crane maneuver, a hovering rocket platform that lowered the rover on cables before flying away and crashing. The Perseverance rover used the same system in 2021. Starship, by contrast, will weigh hundreds of tons at landing. No Sky Crane will work at this scale. Starship must use its own engines, throttling down to hover above the Martian surface while dust is blasted in every direction, potentially obscuring sensors, potentially interfering with the landing legs, potentially creating a crater beneath the vehicle as the rocket exhaust scours the regolith. Nobody knows exactly what that will look like. The simulations say it's possible, but Mars, as every engineer who has ever sent a mission there will tell you, has a way of making simulations look naive. And here is something that should make you pause. Something that gets quietly mentioned in technical papers and then just as quietly moves on. Of 50 Mars missions launched by all nations combined since 1960, roughly 26 have failed. That's a 52% failure rate. The difficulty of reaching Mars reliably is not theoretical. It is historical, empirical, and ongoing. In 2016, Europe's Schiaparelli lander crashed because a sensor glitch confused the onboard computer about its altitude, causing it to jettison its parachute too early and fire its retro rockets for a fraction of a second instead of several. The spacecraft was otherwise healthy. The landing sequence just went wrong. Elon Musk himself, in May 2025, acknowledged that the first Mars window launch had a 50-50 probability of success. He said this without flinching, apparently without concern. And perhaps that is the correct engineering attitude. Accept risk, proceed, learn. But for those 5 vehicles, those hundreds of millions of dollars, those years of work, 50-50 means there's a real chance we watch them all fail. What happens then? The infrastructure of ambition. But let's assume success. Let's follow the optimistic branch of this probability tree, because the infrastructure SpaceX is building around this mission genuinely warrants examination. Starbase in Boca Chica is the heart, but it is not the entire circulatory system. Kennedy Space Center's Launch Complex 39A, the same pad from which Apollo 11 departed for the Moon on July 16, 1969, is being refitted for Starship. There is something almost mythological about this. The same concrete, the same geographic coordinates, now preparing to send humans not to Earth's moon, but to another planet entirely. The weight of history on that launch pad is considerable. LC-39A is crucial for reasons beyond nostalgia. It allows launches into different orbital inclinations than Boca Chica permits, providing flexibility in transfer trajectories. It serves as a redundant launch facility. If a hurricane hits the Texas coast during the critical Mars window, Florida may still be flyable. In the narrow orbital mechanics of a Mars launch window, this redundancy could be the difference between making history and waiting 26 months. The Mechazilla system, the enormous catch arms mounted on the Starbase integration tower, represents perhaps the most visually striking example of SpaceX's engineering philosophy. Catching a 70-meter rocket booster that has descended through the atmosphere at supersonic speeds, decelerating using its own engines, and positioning itself with centimeter precision while balancing on a column of fire. And doing this with mechanical arms rather than landing legs, removes weight from the vehicle, reduces complexity, and enables extremely rapid turnaround between flights. For a Mars colonization program that eventually needs to launch hundreds of vehicles, this matters enormously. Every kilogram saved on landing legs is a kilogram that can carry life support equipment, water, food, medicine, construction materials. The cumulative savings across a fleet of 1,000 ships becomes millions of kilograms. Millions of kilograms that could mean the difference between a colony that thrives and one that slowly starves. California's involvement is quieter, but not insignificant. SpaceX's Hawthorne headquarters continues to serve as an engineering hub. The California coastal launch sites handle smaller missions, Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, that are increasingly being viewed as stepping stones, revenue sources, the economic engine that funds the Mars program. Without those commercial satellite contracts, without the NASA crew and cargo missions, without the Starlink constellation, there is no Starship. There is no Mars. Production at scale is the invisible challenge that receives far less attention than it deserves. SpaceX has spoken of eventually needing to build a Starship every few days to support a Mars colony of 1 million people. By 2026, they had built dozens of Starship bodies and hundreds of Raptor engines. But dozens is not the same as thousands. Hundreds is not the same as tens of thousands. The manufacturing ramp required to reach the scale Musk envisions would dwarf any aerospace manufacturing operation in history. The new production facility being built at Kennedy Space Center is intended to help. But aerospace manufacturing is not like building phones. Each Raptor engine contains thousands of precisely machined parts, operating at temperatures and pressures that push materials to their absolute limits. Quality control cannot slip. An engine failure during the EDL sequence over Mars, with no possibility of rescue, no return mission coming for years, is not a setback. It is a death sentence. The silent threat in the numbers, launch windows, and dead ends. Here is a fact about Mars that most excited space enthusiasts have internalized as an inconvenient caveat rather than a fundamental constraint. Earth and Mars align for efficient transfer trajectories only once every 26.1 months. This is a consequence of their different orbital periods. Earth completes a year in 365 days. Mars takes 687 days. The geometry converges, opens a window of roughly 30 to 60 days, and then closes again. This means that if you miss a launch window, for any reason, weather, technical failure, regulatory delay, supply chain disruption, you don't wait a few weeks. You wait more than 2 years. For an uncrewed cargo mission, a 26-month delay is expensive and frustrating. For a crewed mission, it raises a darker question. What if the crew is already on Mars when the next window opens and the resupply mission fails? What if a critical component breaks after the return window closes and the next one is 26 months away? Mars offers no roadside assistance, no emergency airlift, no hospital helicopter cresting the horizon. In the planning literature for long-duration Mars missions, there is a term that appears with uncomfortable regularity: Mars Opposition Class missions. These are the missions where the launch windows to and from Mars are so unfavorably aligned that the crew must either stay on Mars for 500+ days waiting for the next return window, or take a long looping trajectory home that adds months to the journey. Either way, the crew is spending over a year and a half in deep space or on the Martian surface, with all the radiation, psychological, and physiological consequences that entails. SpaceX's plan for rapid cadence, many launches per window, building supplies quickly on the surface, is intended to mitigate these risks. But it requires flawless execution across multiple simultaneous missions, across a supply chain that spans 2 planets, across communication delays that make real-time troubleshooting impossible. There is a classified feeling quality to the risks involved. Not classified as in government secrets, classified as in systematically underemphasized in the excitement of the achievement. We hear about the engineering triumphs. We see the videos of Mechazilla arms catching boosters like a choreographed ballet. What we hear less about are the failure trees, the fault mode analyses, the scenarios where 3 things go wrong simultaneously and there is no branch of the decision tree that leads anywhere good. Ghosts in the machine. What the data doesn't show. There's something that happens in complex engineered systems that engineers call emergent failure. A failure mode that wasn't predicted by any individual component's risk assessment, but arises from the interaction of multiple components under conditions that weren't fully modeled. The history of spaceflight is full of these. The Space Shuttle Challenger didn't fail because the O-ring was poorly designed in isolation. It failed because the O-ring's low-temperature behavior interacted with a launch decision made under management pressure in unusually cold weather. Each factor, analyzed individually, might have seemed manageable. Together, they were catastrophic. Columbia didn't fail because foam insulation breaking off the external tank during launch was unknown. It had been observed on previous flights and classified as an acceptable risk. The emergent failure was the decision-making system that normalized a known hazard until it killed 7 people. Starship is orders of magnitude more complex than the shuttle. It has 39 Raptor engines on the booster alone, each one a potential failure point. It has a heat shield of 18,000 individual tiles, each one a potential entry point for catastrophic heating. It has on-orbit refueling systems that have never been operated at this scale. It has autonomous landing systems that must function in a Martian environment that we still, despite decades of rovers, understand incompletely. The question is not whether Starship is brilliantly engineered. It clearly is. The question is whether any engineered system can be made reliable enough for human Mars missions in the time frame being discussed. And the history of spaceflight suggests that the answer is probably, eventually, but not without first encountering failure modes that nobody predicted. Who will encounter those failures? Engineers in a control room on Earth, watching telemetry, or a crew of 6 on a 7-month transit to Mars, 300 million kilometers from the nearest hospital? The Martian surface, beautiful, hostile, and patient. Even if Starship lands perfectly, even if every system works exactly as designed, the surface of Mars is waiting, and Mars is not remotely interested in human ambitions. Gravity, 38% of Earth's. This sounds benign, perhaps even pleasant. Easier to lift things, lower effective weight. But 38% gravity is not a minor adjustment. It is a fundamental biological challenge. The human body evolved under 1 g of constant gravitational loading. Every bone density regulation system, every circulatory pressure gradient, every vestibular processing circuit in the human brain was calibrated by billions of years of evolution for exactly 9.81 meters per second squared. Remove that loading and the body begins to dismantle itself. After 6 months on the International Space Station, at 0 g, not 0.38 g, astronauts typically lose 1 to 2% of bone mass per month in weight-bearing regions. They experience muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, fluid shifts to the upper body that raise intracranial pressure and degrade visual acuity. Their immune systems become dysregulated. Their gut microbiomes shift in ways that are still being studied. At 38% gravity, these effects are reduced, but they don't disappear. Nobody knows exactly what living at 38% gravity for years does to the human body, because no human has ever done it. The only data points we have are extrapolations from microgravity research and animal studies, neither of which maps cleanly onto the Mars surface scenario. We are about to find out, experimentally, what 38% gravity does to human beings, and the experimental subjects will be the first Mars colonists. The atmosphere, 95% carbon dioxide, 0.13% oxygen, 2.6% nitrogen, trace argon. Average surface pressure, 600 pascals, compared to Earth's 101,325 pascals. Step outside without a pressure suit, and you would lose consciousness in seconds and die within minutes, not primarily from CO2 poisoning, but from the simple fact that at 600 pascals, water in your tissues would immediately begin to vaporize. Your blood would boil. This is not metaphorical. The boiling point of water drops to below body temperature at Martian surface pressures. This means that every human activity on Mars requires a sealed environment. Habitats, suits, vehicles. Every seal is a potential failure point. Every hatch is a potential airlock failure. Every crack in a visor is a potential death. There is no stepping outside for fresh air on Mars. There is no walking unprotected from one habitat to another. The concept of outside, as humans understand it, the casual, unconscious act of existing in an open environment, does not exist on Mars. Temperature, ranging from a summer afternoon near the equator at a relatively mild -20 degrees Celsius to winter nights at the poles where temperatures plummet to -125 degrees Celsius. The thermal management challenges this creates are immense. Materials expand and contract. Seals fail. Electronics require constant heating to function. And the thermal cycling, warm days, brutal nights, subjects every structure and component to the slow mechanical torture of repeated expansion and contraction. Radiation, the invisible executioner. Here is the number that should dominate every conversation about human Mars missions, and somehow rarely does. 300 millisieverts. That is the estimated radiation dose a crew would receive during a single 7 to 9 month transit from Earth to Mars, based on measurements taken by the RAD instrument aboard the Curiosity rover during its 2011 to 2012 cruise phase. 300 millisieverts. For reference, the International Space Station crew receives about 150 to 200 millisieverts per year in low Earth orbit, which is itself partially shielded by Earth's magnetic field. Deep space offers no such shielding, The current lifetime radiation limit for NASA astronauts is approximately 600 millisieverts, a number set to limit excess lifetime cancer risk to no more than 3%. A single round trip to Mars, transit there and back alone, without counting time on the surface, approaches or exceeds that lifetime limit. And on the Martian surface, the situation doesn't fully improve. Mars has no global magnetic field. It lost it billions of years ago when its liquid iron core solidified. Without a magnetic field, the planet's thin atmosphere provides minimal protection against galactic cosmic rays and solar energetic particles. Surface radiation measurements from Curiosity and Perseverance confirm approximately 200 to 300 millisieverts per year on the Martian surface. A 500-day surface stay adds another 275 to 400 millisieverts. Do the full mission math. Transit there, 300 millisieverts, plus surface stay, 350 millisieverts, plus transit back, 300 millisieverts, equals approximately 950 millisieverts. That's nearly twice the current NASA lifetime limit. It represents a statistically meaningful increase in cancer risk, not theoretical future risk, but actuarial risk. The kind that life insurance companies calculate and physicians discuss with patients who have had similar exposure from cancer treatment radiation. SpaceX's response to this is not denial, but engineering. Develop better shielding, develop pharmaceutical countermeasures, accept some elevated risk as the price of exploration. There are drugs in development, compounds that stimulate radioprotective mechanisms in cells that might reduce the biological impact of radiation exposure. There is research into active magnetic shielding systems, though the mass and power requirements are formidable. But here is the thing about radiation that makes it uniquely insidious. It is invisible, silent, and cumulative. Astronauts don't feel the cosmic rays passing through their bodies. They don't feel the DNA breaks accumulating in their stem cells. They won't know, for years or decades after the mission, which cancer, if any, traces its origin to those 7 months in the dark between worlds. Is that acceptable? Perhaps. Perhaps the people willing to go to Mars are also willing to accept that risk. Perhaps exploration has always required trading safety for discovery. Magellan's crew, after all, had a roughly 95% casualty rate. But they knew what they were signing up for, in broad terms. Do today's potential Mars volunteers fully understand that their mission profile currently exceeds their own agency's lifetime radiation safety limits? Do they understand that we cannot yet adequately shield them from this? The soil beneath your boots, poison and promise. Imagine your first steps on Mars. The ground is rust red, covered in fine powder that clings to everything. The sky is a dull butterscotch haze. The silence is absolute because at 600 pascals, sound barely propagates. You can stand here, inside your suit, and look at a landscape that has not meaningfully changed in millions of years. Now imagine bringing that dust inside. Martian regolith, the soil, is not benign. Analysis from multiple rovers confirms the presence of perchlorates, oxidizing chemical compounds found across the Martian surface at concentrations of roughly 0.5 to 1% by weight. On Earth, perchlorates at high concentrations are used as rocket fuel oxidizers. In the human body, they interfere with thyroid function by blocking iodine uptake. Long-term exposure could cause hypothyroidism, affecting metabolism, cognition, mood, and virtually every organ system. The perchlorates in Martian soil are also potentially reactive when combined with UV light, which arrives on Mars at significant intensity because the thin atmosphere filters very little of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. When UV-activated perchlorates were tested against Bacillus subtilis spores, a stand-in for bacterial contamination, the combination was bactericidal. It killed the bacteria far more effectively than perchlorates or UV alone. This has implications for contamination prevention, but it also speaks to the biochemical hostility of the Martian surface environment. The regolith also contains fine particles of iron oxide, essentially rust, at nanoscale sizes. These particles, when inhaled, lodge in lung tissue in patterns similar to those seen in miners with silicosis, the progressive, irreversible lung scarring caused by long-term fine particle inhalation. There is no reason to believe Martian dust would be less damaging. Quite possibly, it would be more so. Keeping this dust out of habitats, out of air filtration systems, off food preparation surfaces, away from medical equipment, over a stay of months or years, with habitat entry and exit occurring regularly, is an engineering challenge of extraordinary complexity. The Apollo astronauts struggled to keep lunar dust, which has its own set of hazardous properties, contained within the lunar module after EVAs. Lunar missions lasted days. Mars missions will last years. And then there is the question of what lives in that soil, or what we might accidentally put there. If we contaminate Mars with Earth bacteria, and if those bacteria somehow survive and potentially evolve in the Martian environment, we may have answered the question of whether Mars has life by introducing life ourselves. And we would never know whether what we subsequently found was native or invasive. This is not merely a scientific inconvenience. It is a potentially irreversible contamination of an entire planet's potential biological history. Dust storms. When Mars goes dark. In 2018, a global dust storm enveloped Mars. The storm lasted for months. The sky darkened to near blackness. Surface solar irradiance dropped to a fraction of its already modest value. NASA's Opportunity rover, which had been operating for 14 years and survived many regional dust storms, went silent. Its solar panels couldn't generate enough power to maintain operations. NASA waited, sent signal after signal. Opportunity never responded. The mission was declared over in February 2019, after waiting 8 months for a response that never came. Opportunity was a solar-powered robot. It could afford to go silent and wait. A crewed habitat cannot. Global Martian dust storms are not rare. They occur roughly once every few Martian years, approximately every 3 to 4 Earth years. Regional storms are more frequent. Dust suspension reduces solar power generation, which reduces heating capacity, which threatens both electronic systems and human survival. Dust also coats solar panels and optical sensors over time, even without a full storm, a gradual degradation that must be factored into every long-duration surface system design. SpaceX's response, and this is actually the correct response, is nuclear power. A small fission reactor on Mars, shielded and automated, provides power independent of solar conditions. NASA's Kilopower project has developed small nuclear fission reactors specifically designed for space surface applications. A 10-kilowatt Kilopower system could theoretically support a small crew's basic needs. Scaling to a full colony would require multiple units, but transporting a nuclear reactor to Mars, landing it safely, and deploying it autonomously in advance of crew arrival adds yet another layer of complexity to an already impossibly complex logistical chain. Every additional system is another failure mode. Every failure mode in the chain, if it occurs at the wrong moment, can cascade. Cascade failure. How small problems become catastrophes. Let's walk through a scenario, not to terrify, but to illuminate the interconnected nature of the risks. It is late 2031. 4 astronauts have been on Mars for 120 days. A minor regional dust storm has reduced solar power generation by 40% for the past 2 weeks. The nuclear reactor is handling primary power, but one of its secondary cooling loops has developed a minor anomaly. Nothing critical, but the automated system has throttled the reactor's output by 15% as a precaution, and the repair requires an EVA in wind conditions that are currently at the edge of the safety envelope for the suits. Simultaneously, the primary CO2 scrubber in habitat. Module 2 has shown a slow degradation in its lithium hydroxide cartridge efficiency. It's been flagged for replacement, but the replacement cartridges are in the cargo stored in a second habitat 200 meters away, and the current dust conditions make that EVA inadvisable. The crew is rationing power. CO2 levels in Module 2 are slowly rising, not to dangerous levels yet, but the trend line is uncomfortable. The medical officer has noticed that 2 crew members are showing elevated inflammatory markers in their blood, possibly radiation-induced, possibly related to the slightly elevated CO2, possibly a coincidence. Morale is strained. Communication with Earth has a 22-minute one-way delay. Mission Control can see everything, but they cannot help in real time. Now a Raptor engine on the ascent vehicle, the one that will eventually take this crew back to orbit, shows a pressure anomaly in its pre-burner during a routine startup test. The anomaly is small. It may be a sensor glitch. It may be real. None of these things is individually catastrophic. Each one has a response protocol. But together, happening simultaneously to a crew of 4 who have been in a confined, high-stress environment for 4 months, on reduced sleep, at elevated radiation exposure, with 22-minute communication delays between them and any expert who might help. Together, they form a cascade that doesn't kill quickly. It kills slowly, through the accumulation of stress, error, and degraded decision-making. The history of exploration disasters is full of exactly this pattern. The 1970 Apollo 13 explosion was survivable, in part because the crew was only 3 days from Earth. The 1972 Erebus disaster, where an Air New Zealand plane flew into a volcanic mountain in Antarctica, killed 257 people, partly because navigational errors cascaded with crew confusion and flight planning failures. The 1986 Challenger disaster unfolded across months of decision-making that each individually seemed defensible. Mars does not offer Apollo 13 options. There is no burn to get home in 3 days. The crew on Mars is there until the orbital mechanics say otherwise, and those mechanics are indifferent to human emergencies. The body. At the end of the journey, let us consider what a human being looks like after a full Mars mission, assuming survival, assuming no catastrophic failures, assuming things go roughly as planned. They have spent 7 to 9 months in microgravity during transit, losing bone mass, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, and having their spines slowly elongate as the vertebral discs decompress without gravitational loading. Fluid has shifted to their upper body throughout the journey, creating persistent facial puffiness, elevated intracranial pressure, and a condition called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, SANS, that has been found in a significant percentage of long-duration ISS astronauts and involves structural changes to the optic nerve and degradation of visual acuity that may be permanent in some cases. They have arrived at Mars carrying roughly 300 millisieverts of radiation dose. They then spend 500 days on the surface, receiving another 350-plus millisieverts, while their immune systems operate in a radiation-perturbed state in a microbially sparse environment that may, paradoxically, cause its own immune dysregulation. Because human immune systems evolved to be constantly challenged by environmental microbes, and the near sterility of a Martian habitat may cause immune boredom that leads to autoimmune phenomena. Their skeletal system has adapted, partially, to 38% gravity. When they return to Earth, their bones and muscles must readapt to 1G. This readaptation is painful, slow, and carries injury risk. ISS astronauts returning from 6-month stays in microgravity sometimes cannot walk for days and require months of rehabilitation. A Mars crew returning from 18-plus months on a fractionally loaded surface will face readaptation challenges that have never been managed before and cannot be fully prepared for. Their psychological state deserves its own section. And it gets one. The mind in the abyss. Psychological survival on Mars. When astronauts on the International Space Station look out the cupola window, they see Earth. Blue and white and achingly beautiful, hanging in the black. It is 400 kilometers away, the distance of a long road trip. In moments of crisis or despair, that view is not merely aesthetic. It is psychological anchoring. The Earth is close. Home is close. Rescue, in theory, is possible within days. Aboard a Starship transit to Mars, or on the Martian surface, that window shows you something different. After the first few weeks, Earth shrinks to a pale blue dot, indistinguishable to the naked eye from just another star in a sky that contains billions of them. Home is not close. Home is, by any human scale of distance, incomprehensibly far. Rescue is not days away. Rescue is physically impossible for approximately 2 years. In 2010 to 2011, the Mars 500 study confined 6 volunteers in a simulated spacecraft in Moscow for 520 days, approximating a Mars mission duration. They didn't leave. They didn't face real danger. They had access to real-time communication with the outside world. And yet, by the end of the study, most participants showed significant sleep disruption, sedentary behavioral patterns resembling mild depression, and reduced physical activity. At least one participant exhibited signs that researchers described as analogous to clinical hibernation, dramatically reduced activity and engagement. Now add to this the real isolation, the real danger, the real knowledge that if the habitat fails, you cannot simply unlock a door and walk outside. Add the 24-minute communication delay. Conversations with Earth become asynchronous, impossible for real-time emotional support. Each exchange a 1-hour minimum loop of question and response with a quarter-hour silence in between. Add the dust. Add the darkness of dust storm weeks. Add the radiation dose you can't feel accumulating. Add the knowledge that 4 of you, perhaps 6, must function as a perfect team indefinitely, because there is no escape from the interpersonal dynamics, no coffee shop to cool off in, no walk around the block. Historical parallels are imperfect but instructive. Antarctic winter-over cruise, typically 10 to 50 people confined to research stations for 8 to 14 months during the Antarctic winter when evacuation is impossible, show well-documented psychological challenges. The phenomenon of winter-over syndrome includes irritability, depression, cognitive impairment, and interpersonal conflict that peaks around the midpoint of the isolation period. And these crews can breathe outside. They can walk under an open sky. They can contact family in real time. They can see sunlight for part of the year. A Mars crew has none of these. Submarine crews offer another partial parallel. Nuclear submarines can deploy for 70 to 90 days in conditions of forced social proximity, stress, and communication limitation. The psychological screening for submarine service is rigorous precisely because the failure modes, crew conflict, impaired judgment, depression, in a sealed vessel under pressure, are not recoverable. A Mars mission puts people in a vehicle smaller than a submarine, for longer than a submarine deployment, farther from home than any human being has ever been, under radiation exposure, under gravitational stress, with the stakes being not the completion of a military mission, but the survival of the crew itself, and by extension, the credibility of an entire planetary exploration program. What breaks first? The body, the mind, or the mission plan? The question of robots. Are they enough? Here is the argument you will hear, the one that sounds entirely reasonable, the one that, the more you examine it, reveals its own uncomfortable implications. Why send humans at all? We have robots. We have rovers. Opportunity operated on Mars for 14.5 years and covered 45 kilometers. Curiosity has been operating since 2012 and continues today, drilling rocks, analyzing chemistry, measuring radiation, returning data that fills scientific journals. Perseverance is collecting samples for future return to Earth, deploying the Ingenuity helicopter, which was never supposed to survive long, but has completed dozens of flights. Ingenuity showed us Mars from the air for the first time in history. All of this was done without risking a single human life. The argument continues. Robotic missions cost a fraction of human missions. They don't need food, water, air, or psychological support. They don't panic. They don't form interpersonal conflicts. They can be left in standby mode during dust storms. Their failure, while a loss, doesn't create a press conference where a space agency must explain to the world why people are dead. All of this is true, and yet, Opportunity covered 45 kilometers in 14.5 years. An average human walking pace covers 45 kilometers in about 9 hours. The entire roving distance of humanity's most enduring Mars surface mission could be covered by a fit human being in a single morning's walk. Curiosity can drive a few hundred meters per sol on a good day. A human geologist can cover that distance in minutes and make observational decisions in real time that Curiosity's operators must plan days in advance, subject to light-speed communication delays. Complex, fast-changing geological features, ice layers, recent impact craters, signs of liquid water activity, potential biosignatures, require the kind of immediate, adaptive, context-dependent observation that current robotic systems fundamentally cannot provide. The decision tree that a human geologist runs unconsciously in the field, look at that, change direction, pick up that rock, scratch the surface to see what's underneath, requires years of planning cycles in robotic exploration. There is also the question of ISRU, in situ resource utilization, producing propellant, water, and oxygen from Martian resources, constructing habitats, setting up infrastructure for future crews, the dexterity required for complex construction tasks, the problem-solving required when something doesn't fit as designed, the judgment required when a system behaves unexpectedly. These remain, for now, beyond robotic capability. But here's the uncomfortable middle truth. The current timeline being discussed, humans on Mars by 2030 or shortly after, almost certainly precedes the development of sufficiently capable robotic systems. This means we will send humans, not because robots cannot do the job, but because we haven't yet built robots that can, and the humans will go anyway. Because the window is open, because the rocket is ready, because a certain CEO has decided that the time is now. Does that make it right? Does that make it wise? These are not engineering questions. They are ethical ones. The backup planet, fallacy. And now we arrive at the foundation, the philosophical bedrock upon which the entire Mars colonization program is built. The argument that Elon Musk returns to again and again, the one that provides moral justification for the risk, the cost, the danger, the ambition. Earth is fragile. A single asteroid impact, a nearby gamma-ray burst, a runaway pandemic, a nuclear war, or even a slow civilizational collapse driven by climate change or resource depletion could end humanity's story. Our species keeps all its eggs in one planetary basket. Mars is the second basket. This is an emotionally compelling argument. It connects to deep human instincts about survival, diversification of risk, the perpetuation of our species and everything our civilization has created. It has a genuine philosophical validity that serious thinkers take seriously. But the Earth is, by every measurable metric, the most hospitable environment in the known universe for human life. It has breathable air, liquid water, tolerable gravity, a protective magnetic field, a thick atmosphere that filters radiation, enormous biomass that supports a complete food chain, and a climate that, even in its current disrupted state, supports billions of people. The worst-case version of Earth, a planet ravaged by climate change, with reduced agricultural productivity and partially disrupted ecosystems, is still orders of magnitude more survivable than Mars's best case. A small colony of humans on Mars, surviving in hermetically sealed habitats, dependent on Earth for critical supplies, unable to go outside without life support equipment, slowly accumulating radiation dose, eating freeze-dried or hydroponically grown food, dependent on nuclear reactors for heat and power. This is not a backup plan for humanity. This is a survival scenario for a small number of extremely hardy, extremely lucky individuals. The 99.99% of humanity left on Earth remains just as vulnerable to whatever planetary catastrophe Mars colonization is supposed to guard against. If we genuinely want to make humanity resilient to extinction-level events, the investment case for making Earth more robust, more sustainable, more climate-stable, more resilient to pandemics, more capable of feeding and housing its population, is overwhelming compared to the investment case for establishing a vulnerable colony of hundreds or thousands of people on a hostile world 300 million kilometers away. This is not an argument against exploring Mars. The scientific and exploratory value of Mars missions is immense and real. It is an argument against the specific moral framing, the backup planet narrative, that is used to justify rushing humans to Mars on timelines that outpace the safety development, the robotic preparation, and the medical understanding necessary to give those humans a reasonable chance. And terraforming? The idea that Mars can be transformed into a habitable world over centuries of deliberate intervention? Even the most optimistic scientific models suggest this requires timescales of thousands to tens of thousands of years, energy inputs comparable to stellar-scale engineering, and the introduction of vast quantities of greenhouse gases that Mars simply doesn't have locally available in sufficient quantities. It is a vision worth imagining. It is not a near-term solution to human survival. The honest reckoning. So here is where we stand. SpaceX has built something extraordinary. The Starship program, for all the explosions and delays and overdue timelines, represents genuine engineering progress of a kind and scale that hasn't been seen in aerospace since the Apollo era. The Mechazilla catch, the rapid reuse philosophy, the Raptor engine development, the sheer relentless pace of iteration, these are real achievements, and the people behind them deserve the recognition they receive. The 2026 uncrewed Mars missions, if they happen, and if they succeed, even partially, will be momentous. Data on Martian EDL at Starship scale, measurements of surface conditions with modern instruments, demonstrations of ISRU technology, any one of these would advance humanity's understanding of how to eventually, safely, put people on another world. And human Mars missions, whenever they come, will be among the defining events of human history. The first humans on Mars will be remembered as long as human civilization exists. Their names will be carved into the future, the way Armstrong's is carved into the present. But the timeline is real. The risks are real. The knowledge gaps are real. The gap between a spectacular rocket test and the long-term self-sustaining Mars colony in Musk's vision is not a matter of a few more successful launches. It is a matter of solving problems in medicine, psychology, radiation biology, Martian geology, autonomous construction, nuclear power deployment, dust mitigation, long-duration life support, human factors engineering, and orbital logistics that have not yet been solved, and some of which have barely been studied. The people who will be asked to go, if the timeline holds, will go with incomplete information, incomplete protection, and the knowledge that if things go seriously wrong, they are utterly alone. History has always had people like this, people who walked into the unknown with inadequate equipment and incomplete maps, accepting risks that, by any actuarial calculation, they probably should not have accepted. Some of them changed the world. Some of them died unremembered in the dark. The question Mars asks us is this: what kind of species are we? Are we the kind that waits until every risk is understood, every system validated, every failure mode cataloged? Or are we the kind that goes anyway, because the going matters more than the certainty of arrival. There is no clean answer. There never has been. What's certain is that the machines are being built, the timelines are being set, the decisions are being made. And somewhere in the near future, 2026, 2028, 2030, 2032, this question will cease to be philosophical and become operational. The rocket will light, the ground will shake, the machine will rise, and whoever is watching, or whoever is on board, will have their answer. Leave a comment. We need to hear you. Do you think we're moving too fast or not fast enough? Do you believe the 2030 crewed Mars timeline is achievable, or is it a dangerous fantasy? What do you think is the single biggest unresolved challenge standing between us and a safe human landing on Mars? Drop your answer below. The comment section on this one matters. These aren't abstract questions. They're questions being discussed right now in engineering meetings, in government hearings, in university research labs. Your voice adds to that conversation. And if you have expertise in any of these areas, aerospace, medicine, radiation biology, psychology, please share it. This is exactly the kind of video where the comment section becomes something worth reading. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit that like button. It helps more people find this content and join the conversation. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories like this, stories where the science is real, the stakes are enormous, and the answers are genuinely uncertain, regularly. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we'll see you in the next one.